There we go. This is Jack. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I think our sound was off, so the people online couldn't hear us. So I should probably start over so people online can hear. They thought, okay, and we should fix that echo. So sorry, one moment while we deal with the tech. Okay, any more echoes? Yes, okay.
I don't know how to use that either. Well, that's the microphone.
This is Jack. Can you hear me?
Jack, can you hear me? Yes, Jack, we can hear you.
Okay. My camera's still not working for some reason. I don't know if it's on your end.
So for those people online right now, this is Carl Johnson, Chair. We're just getting some technical stuff figured out, and we'll start again. Yeah, I think so.
Okay, how about now? Any more echoes in the room? Okay. All right. Apologies for the technical difficulties. We've figured out the sound issue. So I'm going to start over to make sure people online can hear what we already said. So thanks for your patience in the room for the repeat. And then, Jeff, could you go back to the first slide? Thank you. Okay, so we'll start over. So good evening, everyone. For the record, my name is Jenna Kay with Community Planning, and I am joined today by Oliver Orgiaco, Community Planning Director, and in the room with me is Tracy Lunsford with Parametrics, and online we have Claudia Denton, also with Parametrics. They are our consultants helping us with our climate work. And we are here to provide an update on the comprehensive plan climate element, and we'll be focusing on greenhouse gas reduction today. Next slide. So our plan is to review the climate element timeline, provide a recap of climate element requirements, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time on an introduction to the greenhouse gas reduction sub-element, and then there'll be time for questions afterwards. Next slide. And then let's go to the next slide as well. Okay, so you've seen this slide before. This is the high-level overview of the comprehensive plan periodic update process. The check marks show items that have been completed to date, and the climate change planning work relates to the items circled on this slide, which relates to updating comprehensive plan text and policies. So that's how climate planning fits into the broader comprehensive planning. Next slide. This is also a familiar slide. This looks a little bit more closely at key steps in our climate element work. We are currently in those two orange rectangles where we are regularly meeting with our project advisory groups and conducting engagement out in the broader community. And we are working towards trying to have a complete new draft climate element written by early 2025 so that it's ready for the adoption process during the second half of 2025, and it'll go through that with the rest of the other pieces of the comprehensive plan. Next slide. So we first met with you all in May to talk about the new legislation, House Bill 1181, and our new requirement for a climate element. We came back in June to provide an informational update on the resilience sub-element, and we are back today to provide an informational update on the greenhouse gas reduction sub-element. Next slide. This schedule is providing an overview of our public engagement timeline. So I think since we last met you in June, we had a community workshop around resilience. We are working on wrapping up our resilience engagement work, and then we'll be shifting to focusing more on greenhouse gas reduction. And our Environmental Justice Coalition is working on a similar timeline as staff with their engagement activities with more vulnerable members of our community. Next slide. Okay, and next slide as well. So I'll just do the quick reminder of some of the key things this new legislation did. As you know, House Bill 1181, it was passed into law last year, and Clark County we're in the first wave of adopters of this legislation. So no one has implemented this legislation before us. So some of the key things that this legislation did is it added a climate change and resiliency goal into the Growth Management Act. It requires Clark County to add a climate element into its comprehensive plan. This element needs to address both greenhouse gas reduction and resilience. Some key themes in this legislation, it's big, it's about 50 pages long. If you read through it, there's a need to address environmental justice, a need to use best available science, and Department of Commerce was tasked with providing guidance to local jurisdictions for implementing this legislation that local jurisdictions need to be consistent with. And we have to do all of this by the mandatory due date of December 31st, 2025. Next slide. Since we'll be focusing on greenhouse gas reduction, I'll just highlight some of the more specific requirements for that sub-element. So the county needs to come up with a list of goals and policies that it will implement over the next 20 years that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce vehicle miles traveled per person, and prioritize reductions that benefit our most vulnerable community members. When we get to the point in the process where we'll have goals and policies to bring before you all as a planning commission for your consideration, that proposal is also going to include targets of where the county is striving to be with its greenhouse gas reduction and vehicle miles traveled reduction. So Washington State there's a statewide goal of being net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. That was established in RCW 70A.45.020. And House Bill 1181 tells us that local government, we need to reduce emissions consistent with the Commerce guidance, and Commerce guidance is saying we need to be consistent with this the statewide target. So the state has basically given us the 2050 goal. And so what we need to do is, and in our work with our project advisory group, is not only come up with some possible goals and policies, but also some interim targets. We have to do some monitoring and reporting. So what are we aiming to be at like every 5 years through the planning period? So that'll be part of the package that comes before you all next year. We have a long way to go before we get there, so, but just wanted to mention that will be part of what comes before you. So let's go to the next slide. And now I'd like to introduce or reintroduce two of our project consultants. So Tracy Lunsford and Claudia Denton are with Parametrics, and the Parametrics team is serving as project manager for our climate work and are also our technical lead on the greenhouse gas sub-element. And so they are going to be providing an introduction to the sub-element, sharing the results of the county's first ever greenhouse gas inventory. And I'm going to pass it to Tracy and Claudia.
Thank you, Jenna. And also, I believe that my colleague Claudia got demoted in the online, if you wouldn't mind promoting her. Okay, and then I do have WebEx on too if you want my face to be available for people to see while I'm talking. Thank you so much, Jenna, for that great introduction to the project. And again, I'm Tracy Lunsford. I'm serving as the project manager for this project, and then also leading the team, the greenhouse gas reduction sub-element team. Next slide, please. Today we brought a summary of the greenhouse gas inventory. As Jenna mentioned, this is the first one that has been undertaken in Clark County. Before we get to those results, we're going to talk a little bit about what a greenhouse gas inventory is and why we do them, so just to make sure that everybody has a strong foundation for understanding what those inventory results are going to be about. And then my colleague Claudia will talk about that, and then when she's finished, I'll speak again and talk about the emissions reduction planning and what you will expect from the rest of the project once we get to the emissions reduction planning section. So I would like to turn it over to Claudia to talk about the introduction to greenhouse gas inventories and then give you the results of Clark County's emissions inventory.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Let me know if you can hear me all right. I want to make sure the audio is working for everyone else as well.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes, so I'm Claudia Denton. I work for Parametrics as a climate consultant alongside Tracy, and I serve as our greenhouse gas lead. So I had the pleasure of leading the GHG inventory for this task. If we could go to the next slide, and I believe possibly the slide after. Yeah, so first we'll do a GHG inventory 101 just to have make sure we have a shared understanding of what it is that we're doing and why. So GHG inventory, I know it gets kind of technical here, but it's just an accounting of greenhouse gases. So what gases are released or removed from the atmosphere during a specific period of time, typically 1 year for a community or an organization, how much or how little of each gas. And we know that greenhouse gases are largely from the burning of fossil fuels for energy, but there's other sources as well, such as refrigerants from our air conditioning and refrigerators and freezers. Wastewater treatment, there's a lot of gases released from that. Landfill waste and land use change, where we're going from one land use, such as forest, to another, such as housing. Greenhouse gas inventories also provide a nice emissions baseline, so we can see where we are and where we need to go, and that way you can track your emissions reductions over time. You can track your progress towards your goal. So again, such as what Jenna was saying, if it's a goal of net zero by 2050, this is a means to tracking that. So as I mentioned, it's just an accounting of greenhouse gases. The most common ones are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, but they affect climate change in different ways. So you can see there on the right is a table of the different gases, their chemical formulas, and their global warming potential. So this is the intensity of that gas as a global, as a greenhouse gas compared to carbon dioxide, which is 1. So methane, if you have 1 ton of methane, it is 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a global warming gas. And this is over a 100-year period. You can see the source on the bottom there. It's kind of specific parameters, but the most commonly used 100-year value. So over 100 years. Next slide, please. And just because it's a little bit easier to visualize with a picture, 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide is equivalent to any of the items on the left there, and you can visually see it on the right. So it's the equivalent of 1 average passenger vehicle driven for 2,500 miles. You can imagine the typical car is driven around 10 to 15,000 miles per year, so 4 to 6 metric tons CO2e in just driving for the average car. 13% of the average US home's energy use, 46 propane cylinders for home barbecues, or 1.2 acres of forest sequestration, so the additional carbon dioxide breathed in by trees for 1 year. And you can see it there kind of compared to a human or a house on the right there, and you can imagine how many of these are being released each year per business, per household, etc. around the world. Next slide, please. And then last but not least, inventory boundaries. So we know there's specific ways of doing this that follows a certain protocol. So we follow the GHG protocol, the global protocol called GPC, Global Protocol for Communities or Cities. This is one of the acceptable protocols to follow per the Washington State Department of Commerce. It's very robust. It's been around for a very long time, used internationally. This specific inventory looks at scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 sources. So scope 1 is everything that is being released inside the community, inside the boundaries. So you can imagine combustion of fuel, so driving cars or burning natural gas, as well as agriculture, cows, land use change, etc., and any sort of waste or wastewater treatment that's happening inside the community. Scope 2 is any sort of energy that is being produced elsewhere but used inside, so really it's just electricity for Clark County. And then scope 3 are emissions that happen outside of the community but are due to demand or generated waste, for example, inside the community. So stuff that you buy, stuff that you throw away, your air travel, etc. Things like that are scope 3 emission sources. And the boundary is the unincorporated areas of the county. So everything you'll see is just the unincorporated areas. Cities have been removed, so it's just the county's jurisdiction. and we have split the results into urban versus rural. So everything that's urban is inside the urban growth areas, but not inside city jurisdiction. And everything that is rural is outside of the urban growth boundaries. Next slide, please. So I will give you a fairly high-level summary of Clark County's 2022 GHG inventory results. I will be available to answer questions at the end. If it's something more time sensitive, let me know and I can take a moment to address that, but there will be plenty of time for questions after. Next slide, please. So first, I want to show you the local emissions for Clark County. These are building energy emissions, transportation energy emissions. Those are tied kind of in for first place of the leading sources of local emissions. And again, that's kind of what's happening inside the boundary mostly. We also looked at agriculture, forestry, and land use. So any sort of forest change or land use change, emissions associated with that. Industrial process and product use, only 5%, similar to solid waste and wastewater. I will go into detail with a slide each for each of these local emission sources. But overall, building energy and transportation energy are kind of your main sources of emissions where you need to focus your efforts. Agriculture, forestry, and land use are largely happening, of course, in the rural areas. So we'll discuss the sources of that. And then just industrial process and product use. I'll explain what that is momentarily. Solid waste and wastewater just being kind of smaller sources. So all combined, these 5 sectors, they're called, are 1.5 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which comes out to about 6.1 metric tons CO2e per capita. Next slide, please. So alongside the local emissions, we wanted to provide a more comprehensive view of GHG inventory results, and we also calculated imported emissions. So again, these emissions that are happening elsewhere, but are due to demand or generation from inside the community. So goods production, 50% a large source of imported emissions, as well as food production, air travel, and fuel production. So anything that all the emissions that happen elsewhere that aren't the tailpipe or the burner that are due to fuel production, distribution, etc. Next slide, please. Oh, and actually one more thing on the previous slide, apologies. Thank you. So these emissions are higher than your local emissions. It's 2.5 million metric tons CO2e and comes out to be about 10.7 metric tons CO2e per capita. Thank you. Next slide, please. So here we can see it all together side by side, local emissions on the left, imported emissions on the right. And you can see this is split by rural versus urban, again, inside or outside of the urban growth boundaries. You can see building energy and transportation energy there on the left being the main sources of local emissions, and then goods production and food production being the main sources of imported emissions there on the right. So this comes out to be about 4 million metric tons CO2e for all of unincorporated Clark County, and totals about 16.8 metric tons CO2e per person. You can see the rural versus urban population breakdown there as well on the bottom right, with about 70,000 to 170,000 of rural to urban. Next slide, please. So going into a little bit more detail for each of the sectors they're called. So building and energy, here we see the urban versus rural kind of splits for the different emission sources. So we have electricity there first. That's your main source of building energy emissions. You can also see natural gas there, and other includes propane and fuel oil, and some kind of electricity kind of gases that are specific to transmission and distribution of that. You'll see there's a difference in electricity versus natural gas in terms of the urban versus rural split. This is because electricity is available throughout the county, but natural gas is only available in certain areas, and that's mostly in the urban areas. So electricity is your main source of emissions from buildings, and then natural gas being second. Next slide, please. So for transportation emissions, you can see that it's much more similar between the urban versus rural. You can see gasoline being roughly half, a little bit less so for urban residents than it is for rural residents. I imagine the rural residents, you need to drive a little bit more. But you can see gasoline being the predominant emission source from transportation. You can see gasoline and diesel, tiny bit of transit, off-road diesel from construction vehicles or farming or logging, those kinds of heavy-duty vehicles. There's also a bit of rail and electric vehicles. Those are all in green because they are local sources that are happening inside the boundary. And excuse me, a little bit of local aviation as well, little personal use planes from the small little airstrips around the county. And then that magenta color is your purchased air travel from any kind of airport in the world where Clark County residents are flying in and out. So not quite the same category of transportation, but relevant as it comes to what people do throughout the year. Next slide, please. So agriculture, forestry, and land use, also known as AFLU. These are predominantly from loosing forests, so net forest carbon loss. I'll explain that momentarily, but this is your main source where carbon is released from vegetation, largely from trees. There's also emissions from livestock, as well as some fertilizer use. Those are the soil amendments there. And the net component, I want to explain that if you look on the right, there's emissions from cutting down trees or tree death of any kind, could be from fire, logging, whatever it might be. And also there's some absorbing of carbon dioxide known as sequestration from trees that are growing. So if you look at the last 20 years average of how much has been released each year versus how much is being sequestered by the trees, that's where we get that net number from. So that's kind of, there's more release of carbon dioxide than there's absorption in Clark County. Next slide, please. Industrial process and product use, so IPPU. These are non-energy emissions, so these are not from large industry energy use like electricity, natural gas. These are other gases being released during either use of refrigerants or during industrial processes. So really it's for Clark County just use of refrigerants. These are residential, commercial use for refrigerators, for air conditioners, cooling equipment uses refrigerant gases. And while there's not a lot of these, pretty small quantity of these gases, they have generally a really high global warming potential value. Again, what we talked about in the beginning, that they're quite more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of warming the atmosphere. So small quantities can have a pretty significant impact. So it's just refrigerants, but they're really potent. You can see they're on the bottom left, up to 23,500 times as intense in terms of global warming potential compared to carbon dioxide. But it's only 5% of your countywide emissions. Next slide, please. So waste and wastewater emissions. Again, we have kind of an urban versus rural split here because slightly different things happening in different parts of the county. Solid waste emissions from landfill, solid waste like curbside pickup are kind of the most significant in terms of waste and wastewater emissions. There's a little bit from central wastewater emissions from the urban areas. There's no central wastewater available in the rural areas. That's why it's 0 there. And then you can see septic emissions there on the right. There's septic in both urban and rural areas. And this releases more emissions just by the nature of how it's processed than central wastewater. That's why that's comparably much higher, even though it's a smaller population, I believe, that uses septic. Next slide, please. So last kind of greenhouse gas category is, again, those imported emissions from goods, from food, from fuel, from air travel. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here. This is available in the upcoming report, but I wanted to just flag a few of the bigger categories. From goods, you can see it's a lot of furniture, clothing, construction. They're just heavy in terms of producing those materials, whether it's producing all the fabric, cutting down trees for furniture or construction, a lot of emissions associated with that. Food, it's a lot of meat and dairy products. Fuel production, because you're more of an electricity kind of county, it's producing and electricity loss from transmission of that electricity, as well as you can see natural gas. And then air travel there on the right, urban versus rural air travel emissions. And these are much more estimated than your local emissions. Local emissions are really based on a lot of kind of detailed data from local utilities or from the county. These are estimated based on known kind of average spending patterns of people living in different areas in different income brackets. So this is largely based on the makeup of the income brackets of your community. Next slide, please. Though I think that might be the last bit. Yeah, I can take this moment to answer any questions you may have in a little Q&A. I'm not sure how much time would be appropriate, but I'll trust Clark County to let me know.
Do you have any questions?
I see a hand
Clyde.
raised. Yes.
Brian, if you want to go.
Okay. Hey, Claudia, Brian Halbert here. Just a question on the refrigerants.
Yes.
Aren't most refrigerants in closed systems? So is this saying that any closed system is producing greenhouse gases, or is it the release of those refrigerants?
Great question. So yes, they are in closed system. However, they're not leak proof. There's kind of a typical release. It just releases just a little bit each year. It depends on the system. Some are more like tight than others. So you can estimate these from knowing how much you need to recharge each year. So you often 10 years later, when you have your car, you need to recharge that system because the gases do release slowly over time. So they're from the fugitive part of those gases. So sometimes it's refrigerators being thrown away in the landfill. Sometimes it's just that the equipment is old and starts leaking. But yes, they are in closed system, but they're not perfect systems.
Great, thanks.
Yes.
I have a question. This is Mark Berthold. When we're talking about air transportation, if I heard you right, let's say I fly to Denmark. My entire flight over and back is chargeable to here?
So there's two different ways of looking at it. So all of these are known as other scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 just means it's happening in another community, it's happening elsewhere. So all of your scope 3 emissions are somebody else's scope 1 or 2 emissions. So yes.
If you add everything up together, there's kind of a duplication, really.
It's more of, you can look at it one way or the other. If you can't really combine systems that would create a duplication, that's correct. Think of it as, yes, you taking ownership of your part in the air travel that is happening across the world if you're flying to Denmark and back.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
the same thing would with imported emissions. It's kind of, do we get any credit for export emissions?
That's a great question. Yeah, so it can get a little bit more detailed than this. Let me make sure I answer your question correctly. Yes, theoretically, if you're looking at what is considered your part of imported emissions, yes, you would ideally want to look at what is being exported as well. There's consumption-based emissions inventories where you're only looking at your part. And really scope 1 and 2 inventories would really just be looking at what is being produced. So we're kind of combining slightly different things. That said, most of the communities in the US, right, we are largely importing kind of communities. And if we have not been able to exclude what is being exported, but I would definitely assume it's a really small amount. But it is true that it does happen. So the agriculture emissions from growing food in Clark County isn't necessarily going to feed Clark County residents.
Right.
So there is a small amount of double counting there, but it's really not very significant, and it would be a lot of work to kind of figure out what that would be. But yes, that is correct.
So I agree with you on the agriculture, but let's go to the manufacturing and industry that is exported but produced here. We're up in the 36% range on that one. And if we're getting, charged for everything that we use plus we produce, we have some pretty high numbers that, yeah, we will be glad to share with others. I would think we would want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of industry and manufacturing, it's true. I don't know if we can go back to slide. Actually, I don't have it as part of this presentation. There's more detail in the report on how much is residential versus commercial versus industrial. It's a pretty small slice that is from industrial energy use. And I know in particular for excuse me, I'm going to get the term right, but tech companies where there's a lot of chip manufacturing, we use semiconductor chips in our cell phones, computers, cars, refrigerators have them these days.
Right.
Those are very emissions intensive in producing those materials and those products. And they are sold all over the world. And there's in the Portland, Vancouver area, there's a lot of those manufacturers. And we do have a global shared responsibility for those emissions. Again, so your scope 3 or someone else's scope 1 and 2. So it's someone else's scope 3 emissions that are occurring in the community. And I think we do still have the opportunity, not necessarily responsibility, but the opportunity to address those on the behalf of those that are buying it, because those are really more difficult to deal with from a distance.
Okay, I would just hope that if we can export any of those, because I'm sure that the numbers are going to be high enough without them, so that we'd be able to do that. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
I don't think Clark County had any industrial process emissions. I know that Clark County did not have any industrial process emissions, and I can find out later what the energy use from industry is. I think that's a great question. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Carl Johnson here. Oliver, will we be able to see a comprehensive copy of the report, of the entire report before? Yeah, so that's probably a better thing, because there's a lot of questions I have, but I would sure like to see the whole thing before I ask. Thanks.
And I can just confirm it is posted as part of your materials for today's session, so they're already on your webpage.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
This is Jeremy Baker. So I got a question. So why are we only doing the unincorporated in Clark County instead of the whole thing? Is the incorporated areas doing their own studies, and then are they going to be put back into the whole county at large, or are we always keeping them separate? That's my first question.
So I can answer that. This is Jenna. So yes, the county only has jurisdiction over the unincorporated area for our planning work. So the cities each have their own responsibility to do their own planning and also are subject to this new legislation. But for the county's comprehensive plan, we only have authority to take action in the unincorporated area.
Okay, so we won't be judged on like if Vancouver or Camas or whatever, if they're not meeting their goals. I mean, because we all live in this county. I mean, we're breathing the same air. We're, driving on the same roads. The Vancouver residents are driving through the unincorporated areas and whatnot. So how does that, so, because, I mean, eventually this is weighed and measured, right? Like the goal is net zero is what we're being discussing. And so how does the emissions that are going back and forth and with maybe one city having goals that aren't being met, how does that impact the county itself?
Oliver, do you want to talk about if our neighbors aren't meeting their targets?
Well, I think this is Oliver. Good question, Jeremy. I believe that the county and the cities will likely be looking at a county-wide planning policy, if you will, which will address some goals that we have to meet. And if the community accepts that, part of the measuring on how well or how successful we are will be based on that collective goal.
Okay.
Yep.
And then I had another question so is this mostly just like man-made emissions, or is there natural emissions? Because we talked about forest fires, and this is the forest fire season, and I can remember just a couple years ago there was a big fire on Larch Mountain, and so it seemed like in the report like the forest fire CO2 emissions that we're being accounted for weren't very significant. Is that an accurate assumption? Because it was a low number, and I know for that fire that was huge, and then we've had other fires in the area, and how does that affect like our overall? Because I mean, I would assume the overall goal is to try to make sure that we're having quality air in here, and we're not just playing like games of who burns up their forest, or who what. How does that being accounted for? Can we go into a little bit more deeper on that?
Great question. I think slide 20 would be the easiest way for me to kind of show you while I explain, if that's possible. Okay. Perfect. There we go. So I want to share first that the protocol, we're specifically looking at man-made emissions. You could argue that fires are, of course, not necessarily man-made, but there's a component to it being based on human activity on the planet, right? But building energy, transportation energy, solid waste and wastewater, and industrial process and product use, those are all definitely from man-made sources. Most of them are from fossil fuel. You can see that building energy and transportation energy are specifically from fossil fuel sources. Waste and wastewater and IPPU are from man-made sources, but they're not from fossil energy. The agriculture, forestry, and land use are from a combination of, again, agriculture and soil amendments and fertilizers. Those are from man-made sources, even the agriculture itself.
Can you turn off your microphone?
It's still from sources that we're producing food for humans, if you will. So it's just the forest, the land use change that you could argue might not be from man-made sources. And this is still, though, an average over the last 20 years that we're doing. It's a best practice based on the protocol. So it's not looking necessarily at 2022 exactly. We could, but it might not be. It doesn't really show a whole picture. So if it's a bad fire year, obviously that would kind of skew the results, but also emissions are kind of released over time when you're changing your land use, whether it's from forestry to residential or changing between different agricultural kind of uses. So that's why it's done over a 20-year time period. So it's taken into consideration all of the changes over the last 20 years. So I would say wildfire is pretty much the only source of non-human cost emissions. There are other what's called biogenic emissions of CO2 that looks at the short-term cycle. If you're growing food and then cutting that food, it releases carbon dioxide as well, but that is not considered in this GHG inventory. It's not scientifically sound to include those kind of natural changes to the carbon dioxide cycle.
Oh, okay, thank you. So basically, we're not really. There's a small window of like forest fires. So in the presentation, we were talking about that we have emissions resulting from forestry, right? Just chopping down trees and then no longer having those sequestration methods in place. I mean, but is there any accounting for, like, if we're doing responsible forest management where we're making it so that maybe fires are less likely to happen? I mean, is there any credit for that, or is it just you chopped them down, that's no longer, even if there's less fires? And I mean, is that accounted for at all, or is it not?
So it does take into account the growth in forests. You know, if you're logging but you're growing trees, you're given a sort of credit for that sequestration from those trees. The methodology that we use is really just a straight accounting of how many trees are going up or growing and how many trees are cut down. So it really looks at canopy change over time, and it doesn't assess a value of, is this from development, is this from logging, is this from something else? So you do get a credit for trees that are growing, no matter what the cost is, and you get an emissions, a debit, if you will, from lost canopy, whether it's tree death or wildfire or logging. I hope that
Thank you
answers
very
your
much.
question. Yeah, my pleasure.
So this is Eldon. I have a couple questions. So you mentioned about man-made causes of CO2, and I think Jeremy brought up a good point about the natural causes, because my reading is that the natural causes have are the majority of CO2 in our atmosphere. It's specifically the CO2 that comes from the ocean, volcanoes, and forest fires. So if that's true, then why aren't we also doing an inventory of natural causes of CO2 as it compares to human causes of CO2?
Yeah, great question. So I think we need to take a step back to answer that a little bit. What we're doing is accounting for the change from the before and after, right? We know the concentration of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from before the Industrial Revolution, and we can compare to that. So that's our baseline of what is natural in our atmosphere and what's due to oceans and trees essentially inhaling and exhaling carbon dioxide in its own natural cycle. And we're comparing to what human activity is causing to change beyond what is normal. So that biogenic component, so that natural part of the cycle, is not included in this inventory. We could look at that as well. It can be measured relatively well. So when we're looking at, for example, a gallon of gasoline, we know that it's most commonly 90% oil-based from fossil energy from inside the earth. 10% is ethanol, which is from corn. And so when we're looking at the combustion of gasoline, this inventory looks at the 90% from the fossil component and ignores that 10% from the corn, because that's part of the natural cycle of crops growing in the spring and summer and dying or being cut down in the fall and winter. So it would be smart to also consider the biogenic emissions, but that's part of the baseline. And so what we really want to address really should be the human cost components of greenhouse gas emissions. And they are more significant on an annual basis than the biogenic piece.
Okay, the reason I bring that up, let's say there's 10 counts of CO2 out there, and 4 of them come from human and 6 come from natural. But let's say you can only change a small percentage of what humans produce. The overall effect isn't going to be very much. And so I'm just looking at it from the scale of things.
Yeah, I think
I know,
historic.
I know
Oh,
you're,
go ahead,
I know
please.
this study is focused on just the human cause, but I think the general population says, okay, if we're going to do all this and spend all this money, what is the difference going to be in our atmosphere when this is all said and done?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but they can be found relatively easy through a Google search. I want to say pre-human activity, industrial revolution, the really big difference there, was about 300 parts per million in carbon dioxide. And right now we're over 400. So we've increased the natural amount of carbon dioxide by over a third. Don't quote me exactly, but I know it's definitely within that realm of that ratio. And so we're on a path toward about 450, I want to say, and we can measure the changes associated with that and what would need to happen. So it's actually a much bigger part over time, and if we're not careful, it's going to overwhelm the natural CO2 concentration. It's going to be bigger than the baseline, if you will. Apologies if that wasn't the best explanation, but yeah.
All right, but that's still conjecture, though. That's a theory.
I mean, there are measurements.
Okay.
Apologies, I could not quite make out your last sentence there.
That's all right. We can proceed.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Jack.
Jack, do you need to go on this one?
Yeah. And then my video's turned off for some reason. I don't know if that's a panelist thing or something, but I can't turn it on. So my apologies there. Okay, so
Excuse me, did we lose audio?
Yeah, Jack, did we lose you?
Well, I think it just came back, maybe.
Are you there, Jack? We have lost Jack's video, or audio. Okay, with that said, Jack, if you want to, I don't know, email those in. We can't hear you. It could be from your phone or something like that. With that said, are there any other questions here? Okay, that was great. Thank you for the presentation, ladies. That was a lot of work.
We're not quite done.
Oh, okay.
So we have to do our final few slides. So.
All right, final few slides.
Okay, so with that baseline in mind, we wanted to make sure that you have a good foundation for what the emission sources are in Clark County, and then the charge of the climate element, the greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element, is to address those emissions in Clark County with a goal of net zero by 2050. And so, as Jenna mentioned, we will be working to develop targets for each sector over time, and we are also working on developing the approaches that suggested approaches that the county can take to address those emissions. And so, just want to start off by making sure that everyone's on the same page. Greenhouse gas emissions reductions mean taking actions to reduce or eliminate the emissions of greenhouse gases, the human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases, in order to reduce the rate and extent of climate change damage. Next slide, please. This planning process is fairly standard, and this is the process that we will be undertaking as we are working on this over the next couple months. The first one is the greenhouse gas inventory. That gives us a quantification of the local emission sources and identifies what the sources of those emissions are. So that allows us to highlight the key emission sources for potential emissions reduction. Mitigation there is the same as emissions reduction. So by doing the inventory first, we know where we're looking to see what we need, what Clark County needs to do in order to reduce those emissions. Then we identify measures. Our first approach is going to be looking at those high impact sectors. So again, in Clark County, we're looking at building, energy, and transportation. We're both about 36% of your local emission sources, and so those are going to be some of the primary categories that we're going to be looking to for solutions for emissions reduction. And then, but we'll be looking across the spectrum of your emission sources as well. And we will also, once we have a list of all of the potential measures that are possible and relevant, we will prioritize those measures using a multi-criteria prioritization analysis, which is following a process directed by the Department of Commerce. That helps elevate those measures that are not only addressing the top emission sources, but are also most appropriate for Clark County. After we've identified the highest priority measures, our team will evaluate them. We will evaluate the effectiveness of those measures to reduce emissions and also to provide co-benefits and a number of other criteria are included in this evaluation. And we will also evaluate all of the prioritized measures using an equity lens. And this is, again, one of the specific requirements called out in legislation for the climate element. With the knowledge of the measures in hand, that's when we will look to the specific sectors, the specific sources of emissions, and determine those reductions targets based on the sorts of activities that seem appropriate for Clark County. Again, Washington's statewide target is net zero emissions, and that's what Clark County is being directed by the state to aim for as well. So we will be identifying those targets within each sector to be able to meet that overall target. And then with all of this information in hand, we then will work with county staff to integrate the measures into the comprehensive plan, and then the legislation also requires an updated greenhouse gas inventory periodically, no longer than every 5 years, to track progress. And so you would start to see the results of those emissions reductions measures that are implemented through that regular update of the greenhouse gas inventory. And I think that is my last slide. Yes, so we can also take questions on that process if you have any questions there.
Well, this is Jeremy Baker. So yeah, I have a couple questions on this part. So we're discussing the growth management, the comprehensive plan, and we have a very aggressive growth target that we're trying to plan for. And so some of the biggest emissions portions in this presentation that you're talking about is, like, say, transportation. So if we're planning on another 90,000 family households, there's going to be at least one car more than likely, and so that's going to be a big driver in that. And then another thing was the construction, like if we're going to have all this construction to get these meet this growth, this demand for houses and whatnot, and how is that going to impact? And then obviously then consumption is another huge driver. So if we have our baseline now, and then is it in the report, or is this something that's going to be presented to us at another time? As like, so if we did nothing, this is what our greenhouse gases would be at the current consumption rate, the current build rate, the current driving rate. So is that going to be part of the thing, so we can understand what kind of reductions we're talking about doing?
Yes. So a couple questions in there. emissions reductions that the state has directed, it reviews emissions on a per capita basis. So when you're looking at your vehicle emissions and things like that, you're looking at per capita. That helps take into consideration the fact that we are planning for population growth. But as we know, it's also important to reduce total emissions, not just per capita emissions. Go ahead.
Actually, correction. I think only vehicle miles traveled is per capita. I think greenhouse gas emissions is cumulative, is not per capita. So, yes.
Thank you for the correction there. And there are lots of strategies for vehicles, and including that are coming in via state requirements for lower carbon fuels, for example. And so there is some help out there, not just saying don't drive cars. So there are lots of efforts kind of coming together to help address some of those major emission sources despite population growth. And then you also were asking about being able to see the baseline versus reductions, and that will be part of our follow-on analysis that we will be conducting. It's not currently in the greenhouse gas inventory. It's coming up. You'll be seeing that, though, when we're completed.
So we mentioned vehicle miles traveled a little bit. So how is that currently being represented in this report for our baseline? How do we know how many miles have been traveled per capita?
Do you want me to answer this, Tracy?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, you can go ahead and mention how it's covered in the greenhouse gas inventory, and then I'll mention right now, we also have an additional VMT analysis that's coming up, and so we'll dive into those just a little bit more in upcoming parts of this project. But Claudia, yeah, if you can just talk to how that is represented in the inventory, that would be great.
Yeah, my pleasure. So the VMT data we received was from Washington's Department of Transportation. They have ways to review vehicle miles traveled in the community. We used an online tool to be able to determine how much of that was from passenger vehicles, how much of that was from commercial and freight vehicles. There were some assumptions made that passenger vehicles are largely gasoline vehicles, though we do have accurate electric vehicle counts as well. There was an assumption about commercial and freight vehicles being diesel. We used some, I believe, state and federal assumptions for fuel economy for the average vehicle on the road. And so that's how we got the splits for how much was gasoline, diesel, electric vehicle, et cetera. But the base VMT numbers came from the state's DOT.
Thank you.
This is Jack Haroon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Yes.
you now, Jack.
Okay, question's here now. Okay, so question. So we're responsible for the entirety, like imported and consumed in county. That's what the goal is.
I suppose that depends on what you mean by responsible.
Well, so
But
I buy a couch from China. It has a carbon footprint. And is that being calculated against us?
yeah, great question.
Jenna.
So I think, oh, Tracy, did you want to hand this off to yourself?
Claudia,
or
this
Jenna?
is Jenna. I can chime in on this piece. So
Great, thank you.
the legislation is requiring us to address local emissions. So the imported emissions, in theory, we could ignore them and do nothing and still be compliant with the legislation. We wanted to look at them in the inventory because, one, it's kind of interesting to see how much bigger they are than what's being produced locally. And there's still some things we could do, right? But the county doesn't have direct control, right, over those imported emissions. So I don't know, Tracy or Claudia, feel free to add on to that, but just in terms of what the legislation says.
Yeah, and I will just add a little bit in there. That's why you see them represented as a Scope 3 emission. That's why they're separate, because there is a difference in the control and the specific responsibility. But it also is partially your responsibility. If you buy a couch from China, you're saying, I want this couch from China, and that's why they're producing it. And so there is some responsibility for those emissions, though there is not direct control, and there's not 100% responsibility, because you can't tell them exactly how they produce that couch, right? So you're not saying that this couch is being produced with, recycled materials and, all solar energy and things. You're just buying a couch and it's produced how it's produced. So that's why they're kept separate, but it is important to see the scale of those things and understand the importance not only of the direct, the emissions that we cause directly, but also the emissions that we cause by the demand we have of items as well.
Okay, so another question. We had 2% is like methane type stuff, but it creates, but it has a 28 time.
Yeah, the global warming potential.
Right. So which would equate really to 56% of our damage that we're creating to the environment. So
I want to, if I can just say that the emissions shown are in metric tons CO2 equivalent. So the 2% methane is already calculated at 28 times.
oh, okay, so it's not.
Yes.
So it is a pretty tiny percentage overall.
Except for livestock, which is largely methane, and that was part of the agriculture, forestry, and land use. So I do believe it's higher than 2%. 2% is from the waste and wastewater. Methane, it's mostly methane anyway. But I want to say the livestock might have been more like 5 or 10%. Apologies if that's not quite accurate.
Okay. And are there going to be cost assumptions built into the recommendations? Are we going to try to capture this? Because when I'm looking at all those things, I don't see any realistic plan forward. If it takes 16, 17 acres of forest to make up for one person in the county to make that person carbon neutral, I'm trying to see the economic path forward. I know Bill Gates brags that he spends $7.5 million a year on carbon credits to make his carbon footprint, net zero. And I'm wondering if is this the kind of recommendation we're going to wind up with, is that everyone needs, their own 1,600 acres of forestry for their family. Because everything I'm looking at, it almost becomes nonsensical with what our targets are. I look at reducing vehicle miles traveled, and I don't see any path forward to actually reduce anybody's vehicles miles traveled, because we all have families and sports and jobs. So where are we going? I guess so.
Yeah. I think, Tracy, I can start, and then you can definitely add. Right, yeah, best practice is not just to say, let's plant millions and millions or billions of trees and that will work out, because we can't plant our way out of emissions. So I agree that that's not the best approach. I think that has a place, but it should not be anywhere near the top suggestions for how to reduce emissions. I think we'll be taking a look at what makes the most sense in the next steps of this project, but generally speaking, start with your biggest emission sources. That's why we did the inventory, and you saw buildings and transportation are the largest components of your local emissions, and we know how to make renewable energy, so that is logically a great place to start. We know how to run cars on electricity. We know how to produce renewable electricity for buildings or cars. And then we have until 2050 to figure out how to increasingly tackle those kind of harder to figure out emission sources. But I think I'll hand it to Tracy. If there's anything you want to add, please do.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Cost is a really important measure, and it matters for the county and the county's budget, and it matters for individuals and their household budgets. And some of us have more of it than others. And so cost is definitely one of the things that we will be looking at, and it's the exact method that we will be looking at cost is still to be determined, because a lot of these things are very big in scale and scope, and so it's hard to set exact costs that would make sense. So we're looking for methods that actually make sense, that help provide indication of different costs and help us identify those things that maybe are more effective at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and maybe have lower cost or associated with those. And so it will be part of the upcoming evaluation that we will be doing.
Thank you.
Okay, is there anything else?
I had a follow-up. Jenna, you made a comment that we're in the legislation, we're not responsible for our imported emissions, because I was thinking before you had made that comment that one of the strategies that we would want to try to get would be to make more stuff here and have local, get the local economy going. But that sounds like, from what you just said, that might be a net negative on our goal, because now we're consuming more here, and we're getting, it costs us, it's in our measurement, and whereas we weren't responsible for it for the imported version. Did I understand that right, or am I off base there?
I feel like I need to think that through, but I think one thing is the imported emissions also are another tool, right, if we are struggling to reduce some emissions locally, right, if we're going for net, right, we could always be looking at options for the imported emissions as well. But, sorry, I feel like I need to think through your question, or I don't know, Tracy, if you have an answer to that. So I think it's an interesting question, right? So if you do more locally, so you're not transporting it in, and right, that kind of thing, but you're potentially producing more emissions here, and our electric utilities, for instance, have their own mandate to be net zero, right? So there's a lot of factors going on. So I guess I don't have an easy answer to you, but yeah.
That's why I asked the hard questions, because it's important, I thought.
Any other questions? Jenna, anything else?
Mark, I'm going to throw something out because I keep hearing, you did the 20-year average to get a baseline. So then my question is, as we go forward and report, are we going to have a 20-year rolling average to compare, which I think would be fair? And then miles driven, miles flown. There's a lot of estimations and assumptions. And I sure wouldn't know where to start, but how do you even validate that the assumption you're making is correct? I know there was an attempt, and it's probably not dead, of trying to get the mileage of everybody driving. Of course, then once I go out of the state of Washington, should I be paying Washington road taxes on the fuel? I mean, there's so many things. Everybody's trying to carve their own niche out. I just see that without actual data and using assumption, we don't know whether we're being helped or hurt. And I don't know if that's, if that industry with this evaluation of gases and carbon footprints, if that's even a consideration, or if everybody's so caught up in the nuance and trying to grab numbers and calculations, if the common sense aspect has been lost. So.
Great questions. I can start to address those, starting with the 20-year rolling average for the land use change emissions. Best practice is definitely to keep doing the same methodology next time, so you're really doing apples to apples comparison. So that would be my recommendation for sure, to keep things fair, even, comparable. And that's the case for all of your emission sources. If at some point in the future the county decides to look at things a different way, it would be beneficial to perhaps go back and look at what this year's emissions were using that newer methodology. That's an option. And then the VMT approach with all those assumptions baked in, that is kind of the recommendation and preference from the state. I do think they feel quite confident in their VMT numbers. I've done a lot of these community inventories and I've seen a lot of different numbers, and it does definitely, your results are definitely within the realm of what I would expect to see. And there are 4 different approaches to estimating transportation emissions, to calculating them. And VMT is one approach. It's very common in the US to do. So I do think that has a lot of history behind it. That said, I can't speak to how the state does it. There are other options such as calculating based on amount of fuel sold. That would be a different way of saying more accurate, but then you get into the question of how much of that is in the county, how much of that is out, how many people are fueling outside the county line. So I think the VMT approach, which really looks at what is happening in the county, does make sense, especially given that that's the state's kind of recommendation, since there's some VMT goals as well. But I feel quite good about all of the assumptions that we do. We're pretty careful in how we estimate all of your local emissions, since those results do matter more. Those are where you have more opportunity to analyze your results over time, to keep track of them and to affect change, and where you have more decision making. Things like air travel miles, where we're talking about those imported emissions, they are trickier to estimate. They are trickier to review change over time, and that's why they aren't part of the best practice to tackle those first, and why local emissions are kind of the focus of your next steps for how to reduce your emissions.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions?
Hey, just one question. This is Jack Haroon.
Okay, Jack.
Hey, Jeff, can you turn off your microphone? It's creating an echo. When we look at the buildings emissions, because that looks like going to be the biggest tackle there, is that primarily the type of energy use? Like, is it being calculated? Is it just from electricity use, or is it just the actual construction of the building? Like, how is that? What is the biggest thing there? Is it just if a building has 100% quote unquote green power, is that then take it from down to net zero?
Great question. If we can make it back to slide 21, that would be great, but I'll describe it to you regardless. So we looked at specifically what is happening based on utility data. So we contacted Clark PUD, we contacted Northwest Natural, and we got actual data for energy use. It's not from the construction, it's not from any non-energy uses. It's just electricity, natural gas, and then kind of averages for propane and fuel oil. There's some more detail in the report, but overall, it's mostly from electricity, some a fair amount of natural gas, and a little bit of propane and fuel oil. It does take into account, there's 2 different ways of calculating electricity. I won't bore you with the details, but we did take into account specifically based on what Clark PUD purchases. It's largely hydropower from BPA. Some other components of electricity purchase as well. And so, yes, if people are buying renewable electricity, green energy credits, that is taken into account and will show us 0 emissions. So those emissions are only from fossil fuel electricity generation.
Okay, so we get full credit for our hydropower.
Yes.
As being green. So our 36%, it would be like if you were in the Midwest, say, it could be 80% because if it all comes from coal.
Yes.
Or gas.
Yes, I've seen that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, the more natural gas or other fossil fuels, but natural gas obviously the most common. And if you have very fossil intensive electricity, it would be a lot higher. So I would like to specifically say that Clark County's electricity emissions are very low, especially compared to the US average, but even for the Northwest Power Pool, which is our region in the Northwest United States. So the hydropower and other renewables is really bringing down your electricity emissions. So that is showing that that's not necessarily an area you need to focus as much as other communities, but it's still the most significant source of the highest sector of emissions. So that 36% being from your local emission sources.
Thank you.
Yes.
I just have one question. So I probably don't even know what net zero means, and so maybe you could explain that a little bit, because if I'm looking at the emissions for our local emissions, we have 6.1 metric tons of CO2 per capita, right? So is our goal for net zero to get down to zero on that number, or what is that actually? What is the goal here?
Yeah, great question. So an absolute zero goal would be to release absolutely no emissions at all. A net zero, it's actually similar. Thank you for stopping at this graphic here. Similar to how we look at the land use change. A net zero would take into account the emissions from your community minus all of the sequestration or credits you have purchased from your community. So if you are planting trees, if you are purchasing offsets on behalf of residents, those would be taken into account into a net. So we talked about how we can't really plant our way out of the emissions, but we can't do that for 100% of our emissions. But if we find in the future that we're really struggling to get the last little bit of refrigerants or the last little bit from livestock, whatever it might be, in a net zero policy, you could take credit for offsets or tree plantings elsewhere to bring your emissions to a net zero.
Okay, so if we don't achieve our goals, then we're just going to have to pay more money. Is that what you said?
That is per the policy. That is something that is an option, but it remains to be seen in 25 years what the best approach is. I can't say what that would be in the future, but if you're looking at if it was a 2025 goal of net zero, for example, then most commonly businesses would be purchasing offsets. But I'm not saying that that's the best approach, but based on a net zero policy, that would be acceptable.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, my pleasure.
One more time, any more questions? Okay, Jenna, we good?
We are done with this topic.
Okay. We move on. So next on our work session agenda is the Comprehensive Plan Periodic Review EIS Scoping Update. And again, Oliver and Jenna, you're up.
All right. Good evening again. For the record, this is Jenna Kay with Community Planning. I'm joined by Oliver Orgiaco, Community Planning Director. And we are going to provide an update on our comprehensive plan related to EIS scoping. Next slide, please. So we're going to quickly review where we're at in our comp plan planning process, remind you all about the SEPA process, give a brief update on the EIS scoping, and talk about what's next for comprehensive planning. Next slide. Okay, so we already looked at this in the last presentation today. This is our overview of the comprehensive plan, and we've just circled the point in the process that we are talking about, which is scoping for the environmental impact statement. Next slide. All right, so you may recall back in May, we reviewed the State Environmental Policy Act, also known as SEPA, and that process for comprehensive planning. And that information was also summarized in issue paper 6, which explains the basic framework by which the county launched its environmental impact review process for the non-project action of reviewing and updating the county's comprehensive plan under chapters 43.21C RCW and WAC 197-11. So that's SEPA and its associated rules, And just a few key things about this process. So SEPA requires that the potential environmental impacts of the comprehensive plan be reviewed, and it requires preparation of an environmental impact statement or EIS for projects that are likely to have significant adverse impacts. What goes into an EIS? It's a fairly prescriptive thing. It needs to have a description of the proposal, as well as alternatives. It needs to include an analysis of probable adverse impacts, as well as known and possible mitigation. An EIS presents options and effects. It is not a decision document, but it does have to be completed before a decision can be made. And we kicked off this whole process with scoping. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here's our visual of the SEPA process. The green rectangles are some key points in the SEPA process, and the orange rectangles are highlighting some key decision points for the overall comprehensive planning process. So they're very interrelated. So we held a scoping comment period this spring. It included 4 open houses during that time. And we just want to talk very briefly about those events and the comments that came out of them. And this is all in preparation for that first orange rectangle on the slide, development of alternatives, which is coming up very quickly. Next slide. Okay, so for the scoping period, we published a scoping notice on May 15th for a 21-day comment period that ended on June 5th. The county hosted 4 open house events, 3 were in person, 1 was an online option. The goal of these events was to explain the comprehensive planning process, progress, and schedule, and we were seeking input about issues members of the public feel need to be considered as we develop and evaluate the potential impacts of updating the county's comprehensive plan. Next slide. We received 94 submissions. 21 came from open house events. They were either written comment forms. We also had the court reporter there, so people could speak with her to have their testimony recorded. And then, but most of the comments came through email or web form. And so comments came from stakeholder organizations, members of the general public, and governmental agencies. Our EIS consultants did draft an EIS scoping summary document, which highlights key themes that were in all of that feedback. Both that summary document, as well as all of the comments, were included as part of your materials for today's meeting. Next slide. So if you look at that summary document, you'll see a summary of the themes that, if you read through all of the comments, what's in there. But again, if you want to know the specifics, we encourage you to look at the comments themselves. Lots of comments around topics to be studied for as part of the analysis in the EIS, comments on zoning, urban growth area expansion, housing, farmlands, transportation, rail, mining, jobs, environmental protection, climate, air quality and greenhouse gases, parks and green spaces, recreation, rural character, social justice and equity. Next slide. Site-specific requests, what should or shouldn't be included in various alternatives, the SEPA and scoping process itself, mitigation suggestions, and then other types of feedback that didn't fit into any of those thematic categories as well. So encourage you to look at that summary document to get a flavor of what were in the comments, and you'll see, sometimes you have people saying one thing and then other people saying the opposite. It's quite a mix of the type of feedback that's in there. Go to the next slide. Okay, so now that we have this initial feedback from that scoping comment period, we sort of 2 things are going on. One, our EIS consultants they're now taking that feedback and trying to figure out their plan for how they're going to analyze the comp plan, right? So they need to come up with the scoping helps inform their analysis work. So they're making a plan on that. And then we are now working towards development of alternatives, that are going to be studied in the draft environmental impact statement. So, okay, so tentatively, this is the next steps. So next week, there is a council work session scheduled to talk with them about possible alternatives and where we're at with developing possible alternative options. Following that, we will be scheduling a work session with all of you to also update you on where we're at with development of alternatives. The next step after that is for you all to then have a hearing on alternatives. Again, this is our alternatives to be studied further in the draft EIS. Your recommendation will then go to county council. So they'll have another work session, and then they will have a hearing on the alternatives. Once council votes on those alternatives to be studied, then our consultants can really dive in and write that draft EIS. They need several months to do it. And so they are, our current schedule is council making a decision mid-September with us hopefully having a complete draft EIS by February of 2025. So the reason your meetings are still to be determined, one is we need a little bit more time. Alternatives are going to include both what the county is considering as well as the cities. So the cities need a little bit more time to get us what they're recommending. So we're a little bit delayed there. And then the other thing that's going on is starting in August, there's going to be construction in our rooms up here on the 6th floor in this building. They're redoing our AV system, which we'll appreciate later. But anyway, the location of these meetings is also a little bit up in the air. So we will need to follow up with you all on exact dates and location of your work session and hearing on the alternatives. But as much as possible, we are really trying to meet that September 17th date with council, because if that gets delayed, it pushes everything else in the process out. So that's what's coming up. Oliver, anything else you want to add about what's going on with development of alternative ideas?
Yes, quickly. Thank you, Jenna. The alternatives, as Jenna indicated, we have asked our city partners to submit their land use proposal alternative by the end of this month. So if they do, some of this, we will be able to meet some of these timelines. We, the county, who are responsible for the unincorporated area and the rural area, are also going to be developing our own alternative or land use proposals. What I can say is that typically there are 3 alternatives. There can be more, but typically in our environmental impact statement, you see 3 alternatives. Here in the county, this is our 5th year of going through the plan update since the adoption of the Growth Management Act in 1990. We have looked at 3 alternatives. In 2016, I believe, there was a push to have alternative 4. That came very late, and that alternative 4 wasn't, if I may say, gone through a public process, and as a result of that, even though we included it late, we have to do a supplemental to the EIS work. And at the end of the day, by the time we get to the preferred, the alternative 4 wasn't considered. So the 3 alternatives, typically in the EIS, you have to have a no action alternative. What does that mean? It means adopting the existing plan that you have now. The question then becomes, can you fit in the new growth target and the job within that no action alternative, which is the existing plan? We have to look at that and be able to say no or yes. Then you go to the second alternative, which may be what the cities will propose on how to meet the growth target allocated to them. And then the county will also look at those areas where we have land use jurisdiction, how we are going to meet the growth allocated to the unincorporated area and the rural area. That gets you that three alternatives. And in reviewing that and analyzing that, plus the comment we are going to receive, will lead the community into getting to what is known as the preferred alternative, which you're also going to see and make a recommendation to the council. The council will have a hearing on the preferred, and the preferred will be what the basis for the final EIS will be based on. And that's what you and the council will be considering as you make a recommendation to our council. So that is, in a nutshell, is how this will work out. I can tell you that this is the first time not only the county, but the cities are required to plan for housing by those income bands we shared with the council, with the planning commission. So in the county, as well as the cities, as we are working through these land use proposals, we are going to be focusing, for the county, we are going to be focusing on the unincorporated Vancouver UGA, where we have land use jurisdiction, and then the rural area. We also, as I indicated, we are going to be addressing housing based on the income bands. What does that mean? And we are going to include the scoping comments that Jenna alluded to. We are going to consider what the public is telling us to consider as we look at the EIS work. We're also going to be looking at, we received what is known as site-specific requests, where property owners have made a request, I want my property to go from X to Y. We are going to be looking at that. We have provided that information to our local jurisdictions to also look at the site-specific requests. For example, there are some requests to expand the urban road boundary. Some of those urban road boundary expansion requests, or including their property in the urban road boundary, the cities will have to consider those. For example, if there is a request to expand the urban road boundary in Commerce, they have to review that request and see whether that fits into the land use proposal that they will be submitting to the county. If it doesn't fit in, they will say that that's not in the direction that they're growing. There's nothing we can do. That means a no to that request. Similarly, in the county, we are going to look at the allocation that have already been made to the unincorporated area that we have land use jurisdiction and the rural area, and then be able to consider what type of internal changes that could be made. For example, if we are planning by income bands, we have already known how much or how many units we are going to be planning for in those various income bands. So we are going to look at the existing UGA to see what changes can be made, if at all, and how we are going to meet those housing unit by income band. And considering there are some requests that are internal. What I mean by internal, inside the urban road boundary, I want my R110, single family, 10,000 square foot lot to go to 6 or to go to 5. We're going to consider those. There's some requests to say, I want to go take my mixed use to business park. There's some of those that we're going to consider and see how those fit in. At the end of the day, the goal is to see how that gets us to the target that we have already been asked to plan for example. The other thing I will add is that, particularly in the Vancouver UGA, where we have land use jurisdiction. As I said, looking at or planning for housing by income band, the county and the council, the planning commission have already made recommendations based on the housing code work, which requires duplex, triplex, fourplex, you name it. All those are going to be part of the consideration. What does that mean? Some area might see intensification of density. We don't like to talk about it, but that's what that means. In some cases, like I said earlier, there are requests to look at the mixed use in terms of the split. You know, some look at mixed use in terms of 80, 20, 80% commercial and 20% residential. There is a request for us to look at that split to see how that could be changed, if you will. So those are some of the things we might be looking at. We're also going to look at, there's also some requests to look at the Highway 99 area. We have done a sub-area plan for that Highway 99 area. There are some requests for us to take another look at it. Why? Because that is the next BRT corridor. If CTRAN is going to, which is in their plan now to put a BRT bus rapid transit along Highway 99, it could put pressure for the land values there to go up and it might lead to some different type of development. So those are some of the things that folks are recommending that we take a look at. Similarly, there are some requests to look at where we have some commercial, if they are on major transit corridor where there is opportunity to upzone or do something different, that is also going to be looked at. And finally, there are also some requests to consider some upzoning in some of our areas that we currently zone for single family. There's requests to consider upzoning some of those. Those are things that we are going to be looking at as we are beginning to look at the land use scenario for those areas where we have land use authority, in this case the county. And after we do all of those and we still don't have capacity to meet the target, we then have to resort to what area do we need to expand the UGA. So that's really show your work. What effort have you made to get to the target before you consider expanding the boundary? So that's what you're going to see when we look at the county initiative. And I'm sure the cities are doing the same thing. I haven't seen their submittal yet. We gave them until the end of this month. So they're letting us know that they're going to meet that target. They're going to meet that timeline. I wasn't at the last city-county meeting, but it's my understanding that they're going to meet the timeline we gave them. So that's really, in a nutshell, where we are now. Hopefully, you're going to be seeing the alternatives and have a hearing on them and then make a recommendation to the council. That, when we have that, that is what our consultant on the environmental review will be analyzing. So I will stop there, see if you have any questions.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. The EIS itself, sometimes it comes in volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. We got to be reading a lot. Let me just pipe that in. You've seen it before.
Yeah, I see it before.
So it's all technical, but it's good information to help you, to inform you on the type of recommendation you're going to be making to the council. And the public are going to see it as well. We'll have like 30 days for the public to comment on that. They may even ask for extension if they need be. So let me stop there, see if you have questions.
Any questions? Jenna?
I think we're done. Just, yes.
Oh, anybody online? I don't think we have any online questions that I see. Okay, with that said, we move on to comments from the members of the Planning Commission. I'll start with me. I am glad to be back. I am in the building again. The year down, it's not a vacation, but I'm back here teaching in the county. So you'll see more of me in here. So I'm glad to see everybody, and thank you for supporting me in this time of, I don't want to say crisis, but you know, families are families. So thank you, especially you, Oliver, and all the support you gave me. Anything else for the good of the order? Thank you again for the great meal, and we'll see you, we'll be busy. Keep your calendars open. Good.